Well, thanks for joining me today as we look at Romans chapter 8, verse 4, as part of our Romans chapter 8 memory challenge. And I know it's probably difficult, but I trust that you'll hang in there and you'll stay the course and know the Lord is working and using His word in you. So Romans 8:4 says, "In order that the righteous requirement of law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit." This obviously is connected with verse 3, flows out of verse 3, where verse 3 ends with, "He, God, condemned sin in the flesh of His Son, Jesus, for the purpose that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us." Now, there's actually two views in looking at this first part of verse 4. One view would say, when it talks about fulfilling the righteous requirement, that refers to us. We actually can do that now because God condemned sin in the flesh of His Son, took care of the power of the flesh, and now we have the work of the Holy Spirit. We can now do the law. It won't be perfect, it won't be complete, but we can at least do it to some degree. Maybe the analogy would be fitting where, talk about someone learning to play basketball. They may not do it perfectly and do it really well, but they do it somewhat. And this is maybe how this view would kind of see it. You can kind of do the law a little bit. But my question would be, well, does that really justify the language that Paul uses here? That is the righteous requirement law that's actually fulfilled by us. I don't think that's the case. So I take the second view, which would say that Jesus is the one that fulfills the righteous requirements of the law. Again, sin was condemned in His flesh, and so He took the law upon Himself. He fulfilled it and completed. His name is written on the law for us, done and complete. Back in Romans chapter 3, Paul tries to show how all humanity is sinful, whether Jew or Gentile, and he used the Old Testament and the law to show that. Then he talks about how Jesus has been set forth as a propitiation by His blood to be received by faith. So Jesus propitiates God's justice and God's wrath because He kept the law. It says here in verse 26, it was to show His righteousness at the present time, so He might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. God can only justify someone if someone keeps the law. And Jesus is the one who kept the law, so we can be justified as Jesus kept the law in our place, and Jesus suffered punishment in our place. Paul goes on, verse 27, "Then what becomes our boasting is excluded by what kind of law? By a law of works? No, but by the law of faith." It's amazing how Paul puts these two words together, law and faith. Law of faith. We can't do the law, but Jesus kept the law. And because Jesus kept the law, now the law we keep is the law of faith. And then verse 31 here, Romans 3, "Do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. We establish the law. By understanding it this way, that Jesus keeps the law for us, we can be justified. We actually uphold the law, and the righteous requirements of the law have been fulfilled in us and for us by Jesus." And that is great news. And then verse 4 ends with this description of us, that we don't walk by the flesh, but according to the Spirit. So Jesus has done that work for the law, but then He gives us His Holy Spirit, and Paul will continue to elaborate on this here in Romans chapter 8. Again, Old Testament, Israel in some sense walked by the law. We as the church, we walk by the Holy Spirit. And now we have a way to counter the power of the flesh, because the flesh was addressed by Jesus when sin was condemned in His flesh. And so now we don't live by the flesh, we actually live by the Spirit. This again goes back to verse 2, where Paul talked about how we have the Spirit of life and how the Spirit of life has set us free. So now we don't live under the power of the flesh anymore, but now we live under the power of the Holy Spirit. So the Spirit can give you the help that you need, the spiritual strength and stamina to resist sin. The Spirit is your life. He enlivens your members of your body. He awakens your hearts, your mind, and your soul, because now you have life in the Holy Spirit. And that's good news for us as we wage war against sin as we seek to live a righteous and holy life for God's glory.